this is Adriana from Tasty Pastry Kitchen, and I'm going to show you how to make one of my favorite desserts ever, which is a pumpkin tart. It's a delicious, classic, creamy custardy pumpkin filling that sits inside my tart crust that's been flavored with orange zest. Honestly, I don't feel complete unless I make at least 5 of these every fall season. So first, we're going to make the tart dough. To a stand mixer, add some cold unsalted butter, freshly grated orange zest, salt, and powdered sugar. Mix this on medium-high speed using the paddle attachment. The zest is going to release some oils into the butter and evenly distribute an orange flavor that I really love using during the holidays. Scrape down the bowl once to make sure there aren't any pockets of sugar hidden at the bottom of the bowl. We want to mix this until everything's pretty blended, which should take about a minute. Now add in the all-purpose flour. I usually pulse the mixer at this point and watch intently until the dough resembles pretty large breadcrumbs, which you can investigate by grabbing a handful like this. By ensuring that the flour is evenly coated with the butter, we can prevent any type of moisture getting into the flour, which will then activate gluten and make for a tough crust. If there's any residual flour, I'll usually use a spatula to give the dough a gentle mix. Then mix an egg yolk, some milk, and some vanilla together with a fork. Pour it into your dough. Mix on medium-low speed until just combined. Overmixing at this point will definitely yield a tough crust, so less is more. You can always press your dough together by hand if it's not mixed enough, but you can't really unmix overmixed dough, if that makes any sense. Take the dough out and plop it onto a piece of saran wrap. Shape it into a ball and flatten it into a disc. This allows the dough to cool much faster and more evenly and is easier to roll out when it's cold. Put it in the fridge for at least 30 minutes or up to a couple days, or you can keep it in the freezer for a couple months. Now let's make the pumpkin filling. Add some pumpkin puree, either canned or homemade is fine, some condensed milk, 2 whole eggs, brown sugar, vanilla, melted butter, and spices. I like ginger, cinnamon, freshly grated nutmeg, and salt for my filling. Use a whisk to thoroughly mix, making sure there are no lumpy bits of brown sugar. You can definitely make this ahead of time and store it in an airtight container for a couple days in the fridge. I've even frozen this filling for pumpkin pie cravings in the middle of July. Alright, time for the fun part. Let's roll out some tart dough. Take out 2 pieces of saran wrap and line your work surface with it. I typically use my saran wrap method to roll out tart dough because I find that it's much easier and cleaner, but the primary reason is that it doesn't add any extra flour to your perfect dough. Take the used saran wrap and use it to cover your cold dough. Use your rolling pin to then bash the dough a few times in each direction. This loosens up the dough a bit and flattens it to give you a bit of a head start. Start rolling the dough. Every time you change directions, reposition the saran wrap. As you roll, the saran wrap stretches a bit, so replacing it every now and then will reduce tears. If it does tear, don't worry, just put a new piece of saran wrap on. I'm making a circle tart, so I'm aiming for a large circle, about 2 inches larger than my tart pan, at least. The thickness of your crust is up to you. I know some people like thin crusts, but I'm of the camp that likes it kind of middle to thick. It is a sugar cookie after all that we're making, and I love biting into yummy cookie with the filling. When you reach the proper diameter, remove the top layer of saran wrap. Carefully slide your hand underneath the saran wrap, lining the countertop until your dough releases from the surface. Position your arm next to the tart pan, and with one swift movement, invert the dough into the pan. Trying not to stretch the dough, and this is where it helps to have the saran wrap still attached to the surface, allow the dough to fall into the shape of the tart pan. I emphasize that you shouldn't stretch the dough because this will inevitably cause the dough to shrink and you'll lose definition from the tart pan. You can now remove the outer layers of saran wrap. I use this opportunity to make sure the dough sits nicely against the sides and corners of the tart pan. You want to push the dough nicely yet gently against the sides to get the beautiful impression of the tart pan. There are 2 ways of removing the excess overhanging dough. A more traditional method is to press the dough up against the sides and simply bake it as is, and then you would trim the cooked edges. I prefer to trim at this point with the overhang still being raw, because I like to use the excess to make little designs for the top or little cookies for my kids. Once you're done beautifying your tart dough, place it in the fridge for at least 30 minutes before you plan to bake it, or in your freezer for about 5 to 10 minutes. And don't forget to refrigerate your scraps for decorating later. When you're ready to bake, get out a sheet pan lined with foil. Always bake your tarts and pies on a sheet pan. Trust me, it's easier to transport in and out of the oven, and although not as important for this tart, the foil will protect your pan and oven from juices boiling over. Poke the bottom of your tart with a fork multiple times. The reason we do this is because the key to a super crisp pumpkin tart, or even pie for that matter, is to blind bake it. This just means we bake it without the pumpkin filling almost to completion. Take a piece of parchment paper and crumple it up so it can mold to the pan a little easier. We want it to simulate a heavy filling as much as possible. Remember, the sides of this pan are nearly vertical, so if you bake it without firm support, it will collapse on itself and you won't get much of a crust, but more of a flat disc that won't hold any filling at all. For pie weights, I use a mix of rice and beans that I press down pretty firmly. I've reused these weights for over a decade. It's super awesome because it heats more uniformly and allows the crust to breathe underneath. This goes into an oven preheated to 425 on the lowest rack on top of a baking stone if you have one. This makes for a super crisp bottom crust, but no worries if you don't have one, just put it on your lowest rack. After baking the crust for 5 minutes, turn down the oven to 375 and bake for about 15 more minutes. Remove the tart from the oven to investigate the crust. It should be about 75% done. You don't want to remove the weights too early because remember I said when you blind bake, you don't want the sides to collapse, and that's what the rice and beans are for. So when you remove the weights, the tart will be rather pale but have good structure. Immediately brush the hot tart crust with an egg white. Because the tart is extremely hot from the oven, it automatically sets the egg whites and creates a protective layer, allowing you to maintain a super crisp crust for your pumpkin tart. Go ahead and set this aside while you work on your decorations. You can definitely do some traditional leaves and pumpkins, but I decided to be a cheese ball and put a funny quote on top. Bake these cutouts at 400 degrees for about 5 to 7 minutes on the middle rack, or until they are nice and toasty colored. Because I blind baked the tart shell, the edges had already gotten pretty brown, so I don't want them to brown any further. I created a foil shield to put around the perimeter, which is going to be much easier to do if you secure it before pouring in the pumpkin filling. I'm also gently heating the filling just to give it a head start while my oven is preheating to 350. Pour in your filling and bake for about 30 to 35 minutes on the middle rack. The middle will seem kind of jiggly at this point and you might think it's underdone, but actually it sets once you take it out. If you have an instant read thermometer, it should read about 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Once the tart has cooled substantially, but it's still slightly warm, I press my letters very gently into the pumpkin custard. And then once it has cooled completely, I remove the ring using my hand and arm. But if you're uncomfortable doing it this way, just place the tart pan on a can of something and allow the ring to gently fall to the countertop. You can slide the tart onto a serving platter just as it is without removing the bottom metal plate. But if you want to remove it, you can use a large spatula to slide it around and release the bottom and put it onto the platter. So there you have it, delicious pumpkin tart. I hope you and your family have a happy holidays, and thanks for watching.